They are the not-so-silent minority.
And a lot of the stuff around Brexit, is kind of a lot of the rhetoric around it, a lot of the social media stuff has been fairly xenophobic, if not racist. Hate crimes around, racial attacks have been related to Brexit and have increased, I believe. I think the government has sort of tried to dump it on local authorities and say, oh, well, you've got to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. And we're like, how? It's kind of, what are we supposed to do? What does that actually mean? And as I say, if you've got people like Tesco saying, well, certain things will have to be rationed because, we don't want panic buying, we don't want small shops buying up our stock. And of course, that's going to be the things that are most in demand. These are all unknowns, and you don't want to be accused of saying, oh, this is all Project Fear, it might not happen. Well, no, it might not, but I guess, the planning for these things, you have to look at the risks and the potential, and those things are potential risks.
How will leaving without a deal affect the economic, cultural and social inclusion projects?
Not well, I think. Economic, social inclusion and so on, and cultural projects. Yeah, we do a lot of stuff with partners in France and Germany and so on, Greece. That has been mostly through the EU, of course, so I guess all that comes to an end. We will try and keep some links going with our twin towns and others in mainland Europe, but it's going to be much harder. I mean, it's just the whole message it sends out is that, well, England's closed or Britain's closed. We're not interested in cooperating with European countries because it just gives that message. So it will become much harder, I think.
Just a question out of curiosity then, has Hastings been looking into sort of applying for as many EU projects as they can before first?
We've been applying for some, yeah. I mean, we apply for the ones that are most relevant to us, and we don't just kind of bung in applications for everything because it might be coming to an end. I think you have to look at ones that are relevant to our kind of, the Labour Party manifesto for Hastings and the Council's corporate plan and our overall ambitions and what's good for Hastings. Rather than just spend, because it's quite inexpensive and time, particularly for EU applications actually, which are quite bureaucratic.
How will it affect tourism? Because the document you mentioned worries about the negative effect that it will have on the image of the UK and Hastings to European tourists at Brexit.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it does. It's just as I was saying about, and there when we were talking about the kind of the cultural implications. It's just that message, I think, to other EU countries, other countries in the world, actually, about foreigners not being welcome here anymore. And would you choose that as a holiday destination under those circumstances? And a lot of the stuff around Brexit, is kind of a lot of the rhetoric around it, a lot of the social media stuff has been fairly xenophobic, if not racist. Hate crimes around racial attacks have been related to Brexit and have increased, I believe, nationally at least, if not around here. And all that gives an image that the UK is not a particularly welcoming place for overseas tourists. And it just simply won't be as easy to get here. I mean, if you can just, hop on the train or in Eurotunnel and drive through without any checks, that kind of makes it much more attractive than if you've got to get a visa, you've got to prepare in advance. And it's just easier to go somewhere else.
That's another question I was going to ask actually, because as you rightly mentioned, free movement makes. Let's say you were in France, if you were willing to move to holidays, go to holiday somewhere, you could always travel to Spain or some other nation because you have that free movement.
Yeah.
What is Hastings? Does Hastings have any plans to make itself even more sort of noticed so that it keeps its tourism industry?
Well, ironically, we used to do a lot more of that than we do now because of the huge cuts that we've had to our budget. a lot of the work that we used to do on promoting Hastings in Europe and going to the kind of trade fairs and the tourism fairs over there, we've stopped doing. Don't have the money to do it anymore. So, should we have the resources to do that? Yeah, I mean, that would be one thing we could do, is keep trying to promote Hastings elsewhere in Europe. At the moment, we don't have the funding to do that. It's kind of quite hard overcoming the broader perceptions. It would be hard probably to go over there and say, well, come to Hastings because it's more welcoming than everywhere else in the UK. Don't know if people believe that. Because they just see the issues are at the border really, and the fact that the message they're getting is that they're not wanted anymore.
How would it affect fishing for Hastings a no-deal Brexit?
Well, in two ways really. I mean, of course, on one level, the fishermen think it might be a good idea because we would revert to our 200-mile territorial limit, which for the fishermen here I think doesn't mean a great deal because it takes it almost all the way to Paris. But obviously it takes it to the middle of the channel basically. But of course, whether other countries would accept that, unlikely. I suspect that French fishermen would accept it. And since the entire country has only got 4 fishery patrol vessels, and one of those is in the Falklands, so the chances of actually policing that I suspect are pretty remote, and it would be widely ignored. I think the much bigger problem for the fishery here is the fact they sell over 90% of their fish to France or to elsewhere in the EU, and of course if that market gets big tariffs on it or closes down, it's going to be a big problem for them. They know that.
Would you lower food standards if food supplies were shortened? And what are there any options before rationing? Because it was mentioned that food being delivered to schools would struggle to deliver food if trade from the EU was cut out. If there was a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously it would have an impact. I mean, everyone recognises that. And Tesco's were on the news this week talking about potential rationing. They were talking more about it because they said that while their supply chains, they put a lot of money into making sure their supply chains would continue, the sort of little corner shops and smaller chains don't have that resilience. So what they'd be doing is trying to buy stuff in Tesco's. So they'd have to ration stuff to stop kind of smaller shops coming and buying up all their stock. So it was an interesting point. But so there are others talking about rationing. I know Chichester District Council was on the news about proposing to build a huge fuel tank so that they could store fuel in the event of fuel rationing, because that is one thing that district councils are kind of dependent on for the refuse and street cleaning, of course, because that uses a lot of, refuse collection vehicles are, one day we'll go over to electric ones, but they're only kind of experimental at the moment. But at the moment they use a huge amount of diesel. They only do about 3 miles to the gallon or something when they're going around, because they're operating the machinery as well. So there's a lot of fuel that's used for that, and if you didn't have the fuel supplies, then you couldn't collect refuse, and that would have dramatic impacts, and that would start to cause serious breakdown in kind of hygiene and just the sort of expected standards if people no longer having their refuse collected. So there are some big risks in terms of what district councils do in terms of those shortages and rationing potential. Yeah, I've forgotten the question now because I went on so long. It was about
school. It was about school children.
Oh right.
That actually raises an interesting question. That what is your? Of course, Project Yellowhammer has just been leaked.
Oh yeah.
Do you feel Hastings Council has been made well aware enough of what would happen in the event of the no deal? Has the government let the council know in advance what the repercussions could be well enough for you to plan?
No, they haven't. I mean, the government is. There was a sort of online conference call that I can't remember who it was now. The Secretary of State or the Minister responsible did with council leaders and chief executives. Our 2 directors did it rather than me, But they were sort of giving them a bit more information there, but it's still very patchy. We haven't been given much officially or in writing. I think the government has sort of tried to dump it on local authorities and say, oh, well, you've got to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. I go, well, how? It's kind of, what are we supposed to do? What does that actually mean? And yes, they've made this funding available. Hastings Council is getting £17,000, and that doesn't even employ one worker to kind of look at it. And even then, it's time limited. It's only one-off payment. So what can you do with that? What can you do with £17,000? A bit of publicity, maybe. I don't know. But to say what? There isn't much available, and it is all just speculation. And yes, that information, the Yellowhammer stuff, has not been made available to local authorities. So, because of course they didn't want everyone to know about it.
Right. Did Project Yellowhammer being leaked change how the council perceived Brexit in the UAE or their preparations?
But not all that much, I suppose, because I think probably looking at the report that we put to audit last year, saying pretty similar things, actually. A lot of it is about transport, of course, as well, and ports, which is more the county council responsibility. And I've been to, I went to a seminar a while ago about that, and where Kent County Council was speaking. Sorry. Where Kent County Council was speaking, and of course they got, because of Dover, is this massively busy port. And they were saying at that introducing the basic checks that the government had told them are necessary would mean there would be a 200-mile tailback of lorries in the first day, which is kind of astonishing. And they went through this elaborate plan about how they would make all the motorways, first of all, basically lorry parks. They would use Manson Airport, which is a big empty site. They would then use the dual carriageways and other roads. And then they would close the borders of Kent completely. And this was their Brexit preparation, that Kent would just close and no more traffic of any kind would be allowed in, apart from people who lived there, sort of thing. And, the guy who was one of their politicians there, one of their portfolio holders for transport on the county council, was saying that, they estimated that would happen, they get to that stage in about 10 days. Now, I don't know if that view has changed, but there are some pretty dramatic preparations going on. Less important for East Sussex probably because we don't have any big ports. We've got Newhaven, and I'm sure the county council has looked at implications for that. But because they're also saying that it will push more over to Portsmouth as well, and I know they've got kind of big problems because they have nowhere at all there in terms of storage and queuing facilities at their ports. They're just sort of straight on and off. So, it could clog up the M3.
And then just to bring it back to the original question.
It was... Please do.
It was about rationing food for school children, because it does mention that in the document that might be...
Yes, it does. Again, because we're not the educational authority, that'd be more one for the county council, but because we're not involved in providing school meals at all. But I suppose in terms of the local impacts on children, if they if the food wasn't available for them for school dinners, then it just has an implication for people in Hastings, because how are they going to feed their children during the day? They all have packed lunches. That would just place more demands on that. So it certainly is an issue for the town and something we'd be concerned about. And as I say, if you've got people like Tesco saying, well, certain things will have to be rationed because, we don't want panic buying, we don't want small shops buying up our stock. And of course, that's going to be the things that are most in demand. It's to be the things that people will be popping around to their corner shop to get to put in their kids' lunch boxes, and finding they're not there because Tesco's has rationed them, so they can't get them that way either. So yes, there could be all sorts of implications. But again, these are all unknowns, and you don't want to be accused of saying, oh, this is all Project Fear, it might not happen. Well, no, it might not, but I guess, the planning for these things, you have to look at the risks and the potential, and those things are potential risks.
What do you think the effects would be on Hastings if there was a rerun referendum?
Oh, interesting. You mean, what do I think Hastings people would vote?
Well, yeah, or would they vote? What would be the social attitudes in place? It's
interesting because in the run-up to the referendum, all the opinion polls that were done in Hastings showed it overwhelmingly Remain. So I think a lot of us, I mean, I've always been pro-Remain, I haven't made any secret about that, but I think a lot of us thought, well, it'll be all right in Hastings then, and because it wasn't, you know, it voted pretty much with the national outcome, slightly in favour of Leave. So I think that took a lot of people by surprise. What would it be now? I've no idea. I wouldn't even like to guess. I've absolutely no idea. I think the opinion polls seem to be all over the place, and it depends on exactly what question you ask people, and it seems to depend on the day of the week. I mean, it seems to be very hard to call. The impact of having a second referendum. I mean, I think, you know, obviously a lot of people would. Oh, well, I think a lot of people think that was a wonderful idea, and it's my favoured position. But you know, yeah, there would be those who voted for Brexit first time round and who are in favour of just leaving under any circumstances that would be annoyed about that, and they would say it was, you know, a betrayal of the result, I suppose. I think I'm inclined to agree with Philip Hammond, of all people, on this. Of course, the former Chancellor, who said that he thinks the current, you know, leaving without a deal is a betrayal of the referendum, because the referendum was never about leaving without a deal. All the debate at the time was what sort of deal we'd have. Nobody was talking about voting on leaving without a deal. I think he's right about that.